I don't remember much about my life before I was with the cavalry soldiers, but I do know I was always treated well. The soldiers and cowboys who broke us for work kept us in comfortable paddocks and stables in Leavenworth, Kansas. Once most of us were ready, the men checked us over and we began the journey from Kansas to the New Mexico territories. They drove Kansas horse herds regularly, so although the days were long, the routes were familiar and we had plenty of food and water. There was talk about the many military forts throughout the western territories. At those locations, the soldiers were busy keeping the peace between the native people and the new homesteaders as the territories were settled. At the same time, we heard the soldiers talking about the conflicts between the Union and the Confederate soldiers. The Civil War, they called it. Their conversations always had a tone of concern. My herd left Kansas. We moved through the hills, valleys, and expanses of desert, and finally across a mountain range into the New Mexico territory, and near the homeland of the Mescalero Apaches. Soon we arrived at the stables and roomy corrals. They called it Fort Stanton. It was where I was to begin my journey, my time as a United States cavalry horse. The season was autumn. The year, from what I understood, was 1862. The soldiers at the fort, 5 contingents who had recently arrived there, were busy working on the buildings. Supplies arrived daily, and it was a busy time. The fort was under the command of Colonel Christopher Carson, but for some reason, the officers called him Kit. As for me and the other horses in my herd, we were divided up and assigned to the soldiers we would serve at the fort. I was assigned to a cavalry soldier by the name of Pope, Sergeant Pope. He named me Goldie, and in no time at all we forged a solid partnership. He checked my feet and legs every day. He brushed my coat, and he made certain I had plenty of hay and clean water. I learned the drills for formations, and I got used to the clanking of the sabers. Sergeant Pope cared for me day in and day out. He made sure our equipment was in top condition and that everything fit me comfortably. And together we patrolled the surrounding areas of the fort. Many times our cavalry unit rode out to quell problems between the Apaches and those farmers and homesteaders settling along the Rio Bonito. Time passed, and sometimes we rode after Indian groups, and other times we practiced drills and formation exercises. I enjoyed being in the paddock at the stables with the other horses, and a few of them I got to know well. Some of the hardest days were those where a horse would be lost to exhaustion or to an injury when riding through the rough terrain. But as hard as those times were for soldiers and horses alike, there were also better times. Some of my favorite days at the fort were those days when Sergeant Pope and I would help other soldiers with their training of their mounts, or when we had time to ride through the countryside that bordered Fort Stanton. I knew the country well by this time, and I was proud to have a place in the cavalry. It was strange. When I thought about it all, I started out as a little brown mare in a herd of young horses in Kansas. And here I was, a proud, seasoned cavalry horse with a pretty important job, and I had a fine soldier in Sergeant Pope, as well as a reliable friend. As the years passed, the fort soldiers stayed busy, and the Apaches were slowly beginning to trust Colonel Carson. The cavalry unit had grown since I first arrived, but things up and down the Rio Bonito had calmed down a great deal. Some horses and soldiers transferred to other forts, and new horses and soldiers arrived. Sergeant Pope continued to volunteer us to help with the training of the new mounts. Like me, new horses were assigned to one soldier, and together they would finish their training. Sometimes, younger horses with great potential didn't want to cooperate. Sometimes I stood by and quietly encouraged a new arrival to practice patience and try to learn. And while some horses took a little more time to figure things out, I never saw a cavalryman raise a heavy hand to a single one of us. The men were patient, disciplined, and kind. From my arrival in 1862, for nearly 10 years, Sergeant Pope and I called Fort Stanton home. I would eventually be retired long before I felt I was ready, but I would remain in New Mexico, enjoying the grasslands with other retired cavalry mounts and working horses. The mounted soldiers were proud to protect the people settling near Fort Stanton and throughout the New Mexico territories. They could not do their work without the horses, and together, we were the cavalry.